You guys go ahead and grab a seat. Good morning. My name is Joe Aronson. I'm the community life pastor here. I'm going to try and get this table not to wiggle. So we're in a series called Let's Talk About, where we're maybe talking about some things that wouldn't necessarily be considered dinner conversation. Maybe that is at your house, but not necessarily at my house. Oh, thank you, Megan. I so appreciate that. That would have drove me absolutely crazy. So we're in this series, Let's Talk About. And this morning we are talking through 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 9. Before we start here, I want to just let you know that yes, we are talking about sex, which some of you are very excited about. Others of you not so much. And yes, we're talking about sex, but no, we're not really just talking about sex. Because the life of following Jesus is to serve. To follow Jesus is to serve. First and foremost, if you're married, to serve your spouse. Putting their needs and their desires before your own. And if you're single, to serve the Lord with the same zeal that you would serve your spouse. Because your life is a picture of the gospel. Your life is a picture of Jesus. You are called to be his hands and his feet in the world around you. You bear that mark of being created in the image of God, a living statue that the outside world observes about what God is like. And so, yeah, we're talking about sex, but this is really about that. This isn't just about sex. This really is about that. This is about life. This is about serving one another. Last week, we started this conversation talking about how we are private property. Pastor David talked about how we are set apart, wholly for the Lord. And because of that, we are supposed to flee from sexual immorality because we are private property. We are owned by our King Jesus. And some of us may be left thinking, and just like this church in Corinth, as they're hearing some of these things, like, okay, well then what then, as a sexual creature, am I supposed to do? Am I just supposed to, suppress this part of myself? And we can't get this wrong. The Lord tells us that we need to flee from sexual immorality, the misuse of sex, not to flee from sexuality. That's so critical that you get that. Flee from sexual immorality. Don't flee from sexuality. So as we read this here, this will be up on the screen. If you have your Bible, turn there with me. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, starting in verse 1. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and to the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Let's get to work. We have some things to cover. As we read this, remember, we are literally reading someone else's mail, okay? So he starts out here in verse 1. He says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. So this church in Corinth had written to Paul, their founding pastor, who had left and left another pastor in charge. They're writing to him saying, hey, what do you think about this? We're starting to wrestle with some of this stuff, and we want to get your opinion because we respect you and we have history. You spent 18 months with us. And they say, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. What do you think about that, Paul? And really kind of behind this, we understand from looking at Roman society in Corinth and in different parts of their empire, that there's this debate that's happening within this time. There's this debate about whether or not it's appropriate to enjoy sex for pleasure or inspired by passion, or is it only appropriate to engage in sexual activity for the procreation of children? That's the debate that they're really wrestling with here. Like, can we enjoy this, or do we just have to do this in order to make babies? Paul, we really need some guidance here. And as we look at that world, marriage looked a little different then than it does now. Most time when we get married, and I sit down with a couple, and they're looking at getting married, and we go through premarital counseling, it's because they love each other. And they want to commit themselves to this person. But in the Roman world, especially if you were in the upper classes of society, most marriages were arranged. It was more of a business interaction. And you would marry this person, and the thing that you were almost most concerned about was having a child, so that you would have an heir, so that you would have something to give your assets to, this child would continue your family name and that legacy. And within the Roman household, generally speaking, there was the husband, there was the wife, there were the children, and then there were the household slaves. The man being the head of the house, so to speak, in a very real sense of the term, was almost seen to own his wife, own his children, and own his slaves. Those three things were considered to be his property. And so he would engage with sexual activity with his wife in order to create children. But then when he wanted to just have some fun, he may go to his slaves, which within their world was totally and completely appropriate and totally morally okay because it was his property. He couldn't go sleep with somebody else's slave because that was their property, but this was his property. And as we've talked about multiple times, in this Roman world, especially in Corinth was known for its temple to Aphrodite, this goddess that employed 1,000 temple prostitutes. And so they would go and to have fun, sex recreationally, they would engage with their slaves, or they would go to, in this type of hybrid recreation/worship, go and engage with sexual activity with these temple prostitutes. And what Paul is addressing here, and what they're saying are these two things okay? Because you don't really have sex with your spouse just for fun in the Roman world. You reserve that for other people. Is that okay, Paul? And the answer that he gives, and we looked at this last week, was no, absolutely not. You need to flee from sexual immorality. Flee from sexual immorality, but don't necessarily flee from sexuality. Because in the background of this whole thing, we have to understand God's design for this. And in order to understand God's design for sex, we have to understand God's design for marriage. So let's get to work here. Number one thing that you need to understand, human sexuality is holy. Human sexuality is not dirty or sinful when it's used in the way that God desires for it to be used. Human sexuality is holy. Now, certainly sin has screwed that whole thing up. We see the way that sexuality causes damage in the world around us. But within marriage, human sexuality is holy because God created us as sexual creatures. We've turned all the way to the beginning of your Bible, to Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. I'm just going to read these few verses here because this is important for us to lay this foundation here. Genesis chapter 1:28. And God blessed them, Adam and Eve. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Be fruitful and multiply. The first command that these first people are given is to go and have children, to engage in sexual relations and have children, to be fruitful and to multiply. Next chapter, chapter 2. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. When God creates Adam and Eve, he creates Adam and he creates Eve as his partner, as his equal. They become one flesh. Adam and Eve and all these people who have come after them and gotten married enter into this covenant of marriage. It's this covenant where you give yourself wholly to this other person. You stand the way that we do this. You stand before your family and your friends and you invite everybody that you care about and some of the people that you don't care about because you have to. You invite these people and you stand before them and before God himself and you declare that this is the person that I am committing to. Of all of the other people in the world, I'm committing to this person. I'm going to give myself to them completely. I'm only going to give myself to them completely. In sickness and in health, in good times and in bad times, until death parts us, I am with this person. I'm all in. And they shall become one flesh. So we see this from the very beginning that God has created this. Paul expounds on this in Ephesians chapter 5. He's talking about marriage. And he's talking about the relationship between a husband and a wife. And how, it's about the husband and a wife, but it's really about something so much bigger. He says that this is a picture of the gospel. This is a picture of the good news of Jesus. This is a picture of Jesus and the church. The way that Jesus loves the church and lays down his life. Husbands are to lay down their lives for their wives. And as the church reveres and respects Christ, the wife is to revere and to respect her husband and to follow in his leadership. Marriage is a picture of Christ and the church because this is really about that. This is never just about marriage. This is never just about sex. This is about that. This is a Jesus issue. And so this is the framework in which we see sex as God creates it to be. It's important to note, and we talked about this last week, that sexual activity, whether it's heterosexual or homosexual, outside of a marriage covenant between a husband and a wife is sin and is out of bounds for the Christian. But that doesn't mean that it's bad. So we see this marriage, these two that become one flesh. Literally, they unite physically. There's an entire book of the Bible that's about this, that some would even classify it as erotica. It's called the Song of Solomon. Single men, I wouldn't suggest you go and read this book this afternoon. I'm sitting in my office this past week, and I'm reading through this because I'm like, this is kind of important, and I'm like, oh my goodness. And Tommy comes walking in and he's like, what's the matter with you? I'm like, is it hot in here or is it just me? What is going on? My in-laws are here. Thanks, Jeremiah. Appreciate that. The point here, is it hot in here now? Goodness. The point is, sex is to be celebrated within marriage. There's an entire book of the Bible that's dedicated to that. As we see this couple, they engage in the ancient Near East practice of getting married, and it looks different than our marriages do. But when they finally consummate their marriage and they have finally become married and they're on their honeymoon, this is what God says to them and speaks over them. And this whole thing is poetry. And this is what God says. He says, eat, friends, drink, and be drunk with love. The way another version of the Bible, another translation says is, have your fill. Have as much of it as you want because this is good and godly. I delight in this. This author named Gary Thomas, he wrote this book called Sacred Marriage. I want to read this quote, and part of it will be up on the screen here. Sex is about physical touch, to be sure, but it's about far more than what's going on inside us. Developing a fulfilling sex life means I concern myself more with bringing generosity and service to the bed than bringing washboard abs. It means I see my wife as a holy temple of God, not just as a tantalizing human body. It even means that sex becomes a form of physical prayer, a picture of heavenly intimacy that rivals the Shekinah glory of old. It even means that sex becomes a form of physical prayer, a picture of heavenly intimacy that rivals the Shekinah glory of old. Sex is holy. Human sexuality is holy when it's used in the way that it's supposed to be used. Sexuality is also powerful. Think about this for a second and take the biology part out of your brain for just a minute. Think about what happens when a husband and wife come together physically. There's this point where the lines between the two of them begin to blur because they are one flesh. They have given themselves to this other person totally and completely. And this culminates with sex in and of itself. But as these two become one flesh and the lines between the two of them begin to blur, life is created. And we could talk about the biology behind that. We're not going to, but we could. And sometimes I think we're so jaded by the scientific aspects of things that we forget to stop and look at the beauty that happens here. God invites us to be a part of creating because he is a creator. It's almost like God, as he exists in this web of relationships, as the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, they experience this intimacy between the three of them that results in life. It's almost like our sexuality is part of bearing God's image, of being that walking, breathing, talking statue, where when you experience this type of relationship like God has, that oneness, that life is created. Sexuality is powerful. You give yourself completely to a person. Genesis says that Adam and Eve, they were together and they were both naked and unashamed. To know someone and to be known on that level is an incredible thing. Sexuality is powerful. And just like lots of other things that are powerful, if not used properly, it can be destructive. My wife and I bought our house. We bought our first house almost 2 years ago. And one of the things that was on our must-have list was a fireplace. A wood-burning fireplace, non-negotiable. We were going to have that. No offense to you people who have gas fireplaces, it's fine, but it's subpar in my opinion. A wood-burning fireplace, non-negotiable for our family. And so we bought a house that had a wood-burning fireplace. And one of our favorite things, we burn like all winter long. We love having fires in our house. On a cold winter day after I've gotten done snow blowing outside, one of my favorite things to do, and the kids love to do this too when they're running around outside and their hands are blue and almost icicles. They come and they stand by the fire, they go like this, and then it gets a little too warm, then they run over to the other side of the room, and then they come back. It's a whole lot of fun. Winter in Wisconsin, it's a great thing if you have a wood-burning fireplace. Fire is a great thing. It's a really, really great thing. It keeps you warm during the wintertime. You can cook food for all of your friends over a fire. It's this powerful tool that we have. And one time we were sitting down, I think we were watching the news, something like that. I don't remember what it was, but it was one of the first times that we had burned, and I was an idiot. And I didn't have the wire mesh thing across the wood-burning stove. Or the fireplace. And so one of the logs, it popped, and this spark comes down and lands on a rug. Now, it didn't burn the house down, praise the Lord. But I jumped up, and I'm stomping this thing out, right? And I reacted like that. Why? Because I like my house, and I don't want my house to burn down. Fire is this very good thing when it's in the right place. As soon as it gets outside of that place, it becomes a very destructive thing. We don't have wildfires around here all that often. But the people that do, you can literally see the destruction that this fire has as it consumes entire neighborhoods. And in that same way that fire is powerful, so is sexuality. You've got to keep that fire in the fireplace. Otherwise, you're literally going to burn your house down. And we look at the way that this relationship works between the husband and a wife. And one of the things that jumps out immediately is the equality of their sexual relationship. The way that the ESV translate this is conjugal rights, which is a very terrible way to translate this. The NLT says it in a much more palatable type of way where you don't have to go and look in the dictionary. The NLT says it this way: the husband should fulfill his wife's sexual needs, and the wife should fulfill her husband's needs. The wife gives authority over her body to her husband, and the husband gives authority over his body to his wife. Now, we read this, and we're like, yep, I get that. That makes total sense. But when Paul writes this is revolutionary. As these husbands hear this read aloud as their church gathers, they hear that the husband needs to meet the needs of his wife, which within their context is seen to be his property. You mean to tell me that I have a responsibility to my wife? Is that what you're telling me, Paul? Absolutely it is. We don't know for sure, but a lot of people think that this statement was the first time that this was said ever. This equality of relationships. And this was the only time that this was said for like 1,000 years. This is unbelievable. Because these men that are hearing this are used to being able to do whatever they want, whenever they want, with anybody that from their culture was deemed to be morally acceptable. Temple prostitutes and slaves, primarily. And so these men are saying, we can do whatever we want. And Paul says, no, you cannot. You cannot do whatever you want because your body does not belong to you. You cannot go have sex with the slave whenever you want. You cannot go to the temple of Aphrodite whenever you want. You can't even demand sex from your spouse. The idea that men were obligated to their spouse was a totally and completely foreign concept. This idea that your body is not your own, that you were, like we saw last week, you were bought with a price. And glorify God in your body. And so as we read this, we start to understand that our bodies, our physical bodies, first and foremost belong to Jesus. If you're married, then secondly, it belongs to your spouse, and only to your spouse. It's for him or her alone. Now, if you're not married, your body belongs first and foremost to Jesus. That's it. So, he continues on, verse 5. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, I'm not going to say that the only reason that you shouldn't have sex with your spouse is if you're going to spend time praying. Not going to say that, but that's what Paul was saying. It's very possible that he's speaking to specific situations when he talks through some of this stuff, and we'll see a little bit more of this next week. So let's not put too much stock in the we're only going to abstain from having sex with our spouse when we're devoting ourselves to prayer. That's certainly a good and godly reason to abstain from having sex. However, let's not say that that's the only reason. Within this context, Paul sees this sexual immorality happening with these different members of the church, sleeping with their slaves and different temple prostitutes, and he says, you shouldn't be sleeping with them. You should be sleeping with your spouse. Your spouse is not simply for creating children. Your spouse is to meet those needs that you have and fulfill those desires that you have. So, as we look at sexual immorality, one of the things that you need to know if you are married is that you need to help your spouse to flee from sexual immorality. And if you're married, sex should be a part of your relationship in some way, in some shape, in some form. If you're not married, sex should not be a part of your life. Because your body is not your own. So some of the questions that you have to ask yourself is, what does my spouse need? What does my spouse desire? Some of the conversations that you should ask your spouse in the ride home. What do you need? What do you desire? One commentator, don't say that when their kids are in the car, especially if they're like teenagers. Spare them from that, please. One commentator, when talking about this verse 5, says it this way. Simply put, married men and women are obligated to have sex with their partners. Another said, to refuse to have relations with one spouse is to withhold what is properly theirs, just as an employer might keep back by fraud the wages of the laborers. But this is really about that. The point is that you need to serve one another. Because to follow Jesus is to have a life of service. I'm 29. Some of you are like, why are you talking to me about this? You're barely out of diapers. I received that. I'm 29. I'm not 60. I'm not 70. I'm not 80. I've not weathered decades of marriage. But I know enough to know that the sexual aspect of relationships changes. So what this passage is not saying, you must have sex once a week in order to be happily married and good in the eyes of God. That's not what this is saying. What this is saying is that you need to communicate with your partner. You need to communicate with your spouse, sharing your needs and your desires, and hearing their needs and their desires. And as far as you are able to meet those needs in a God-honoring, God-glorifying way. But this is complicated. I'm not naive enough to know that there's not a lot of baggage that comes along with sexuality. There are health things. There's emotional scarring. There's emotional baggage. There's tons of different components to this. What sex looks like for you and for your spouse may look very different from another couple, and that's okay. But this is something that you have to talk about. And you need to come at this from an attitude of, how can I serve you? Because following Jesus is to serve. We talk about generosity. We talk about generosity in terms of finances all the time because that's one of the easiest ways to talk about it. But what would it look like for you to be generous within your marriage? That person that you are one flesh with, that you are closest to. How can you be most generous with them? You can't unilaterally decide what this area of your marriage is going to look like. You just can't, because you are a team. This has to be a conversation. It doesn't mean it's a conversation you have to have every day, but every once in a while, have this conversation. How are we doing? How is this area? You're a team. You tackle this together. As an act of worship, you serve your spouse. In a lot of ways, you serve your spouse all the time in a plethora of different areas. But here specifically, Paul points to sex. Okay. One of the things when we talk about all this stuff, and churches like to talk about family because family is important. We like to talk about marriage because marriage is important. We like to talk about sex because sex is important. But here's what we can't do. We can't make a gift into a god. The goal of the Christian life is not to get married and have a bunch of kids. Good and godly thing to do, get married and have a bunch of kids. That's not the goal. So sometimes what we do is we make an idol out of family. And we say that this is what we're moving towards. We make an idol out of our spouse. We make an idol out of sex, even within marriage. We can say that this is the thing that I desire most. And this becomes a consumption thing rather than a giving and generosity sort of thing. So don't make a gift into a god. Family, spouse, and sex are good and godly things in a world full of rom-coms and you complete me's. We need to call that as we see it. That is nothing more than idolatry. Because a person will not complete you. Jesus will complete you. Family, spouse, sex, they are not the end in and of themselves. They serve a greater purpose. What's so interesting here, in verse 7, Paul's talking about, I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. He's talking about married and being single. What's interesting is when he uses that word gift, that's the same Greek word when talking about spiritual gifts, like healing and prophecy and speaking in tongues that we're going to talk about later within this book. Your singleness, if you are single, is a gift from God. Your marriage, if you're married, is a gift from God. But they are not a God. If you are married, don't feel like you've arrived. Some of you say, don't worry about that. I am well aware that I have not arrived in being married. But if you're not yet married, don't feel like that when you get married that you will have arrived. If you're a widow or a widower, don't feel like you no longer have a purpose because your spouse is no longer here on this earth. Because the purpose of your life, whether married or single, is to make much of Jesus. The life of following Jesus is to serve. First and foremost, your spouse, if you are married, putting their needs and their desires before your own. And if you are single, it's to serve the Lord with the same zeal that you would serve your spouse. Your life is a picture of Jesus. You are private property. This is really about that. We invite the worship team up. They're going to lead us in a few last songs as we take communion this morning. I hope that this has been an encouraging message for you, but it's not lost on me that this may have hit a nerve with some of you. There is so much brokenness regarding sexuality, not just within our culture, and sure, we can talk about that, but with us as individuals. There's so much brokenness. Things that you have done that you are ashamed of, things that have happened to you, whether that's inside of a marriage or outside of a marriage. There is brokenness. And you say, when we talk about sexuality as being powerful, you say, I am well aware of sexuality being powerful because I have experienced that destruction. If that's you this morning, if there is this trauma that you have experienced, don't sweep that under the rug. Please don't sweep that under the rug. I don't know what that healing process is going to look like for you, but I know that it starts and ends with Jesus.